Conservative speechwriter and Times columnist Daniel Finkelstein explores how some of the greatest speeches never made with the help of impressionist John Coleshaw in the event of moon disaster.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
What has surfaced is a memo from one Bill Sapphire to H.R. Bob Haldeman, who was then President Nixon's chief of staff. We can put it on the screen. It was called "In the Event of Moon Disaster."
Velocity 26,000 feet per second.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. Do you read? Over. Apollo 11, this is Houston. Do you read? Over.
In July 1969, a tiny space capsule blasted into the cavernous darkness between Earth and the Moon, and a landing pod extended its spindly legs towards the Moon's surface. But the men inside, the first men on the Moon, never returned to Earth.
Most people here suspected something very unpleasant had happened during the redocking operation. Despite high static, many of us heard Mike Collins in the command craft say all hell had broken loose.
Don't forget, President Kennedy's speech today has been billed as a major address. KLIF News, of course, will be bringing you excerpts of that speech throughout the afternoon, okay? Mighty fine.
In November 1963, an open-topped car carrying the President of the United States drove by a book depository in downtown Dallas. John F. Kennedy completed his engagements in the city before returning to Washington. The history of the world is not just a litany of things that happened. It's the story of the myriad things that didn't happen, the tragedy averted, the victory thwarted. But this history is often difficult to tell. How can you recount the tale of what might have been? Well, there is one way. Through the speeches that could have been delivered, but weren't. On the day of JFK's death, for instance, he was due to deliver a speech, and we still have the words he planned. Speechwriters are, it turns out, like the wily coyote of history, still running when the ground below them has disappeared. The archives are full of texts written for great moments or small moments that never happened, words never delivered, the history that might have been. A history where there was no moon landing, say, but moon tragedy. If the first men on the moon had not come back, then President Nixon would have been called on to deliver this speech, which now resides in the files of the Nixon Presidential Library.
Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice.
I'm in a cold sweat by the end of it almost.
Andrew Smith, author of Moondust, has interviewed every living astronaut who walked on the moon.
I read it and I think, God, yeah, you know, how possible that was. And now it's fixed in our history, and we think of it as being this well, people think of it in all kinds of ways, but, you know, it was something that did succeed. And it just reminds you how easily that could have not been the case, and how different so many things would look if that had happened.
These two men are laying down their lives in mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding. They will be mourned by their families and friends. They will be mourned by their nation. They will be mourned by the people of the world. They will be mourned by a Mother Earth that dared send 2 of her sons into the unknown.
The thing that strikes me most about it is that it's written from the perspective of the astronauts being still alive but stuck on the moon and not able to get back, which was the real possibility, because there was one rocket that was going to boost them back off the surface of the moon, and if that went wrong, that's it, they wouldn't come back. And so there's a real pathos to that sense of 2 people on the surface of the moon knowing there's no way to get back and just having to wait it out till the end, and the whole world watching them, knowing that was happening and looking into the sky and seeing the moon and knowing there were 2 people on there who weren't going to come back, which is a horrifying situation.
The author of In Event of Moon Disaster was the great American speechwriter and journalist William Safire. In 2008, he spoke to American network C-SPAN about a speech that demanded every ounce of gravitas and compassion that a speechwriter can muster, and yet that he prayed would never have to be delivered.
The speech that never was. That was a moving night. The astronaut, Frank Borman, was involved. He was a liaison with the NASA. And we were all asked to contribute ideas for the first the plaque, that goes on the moon. A big argument about that. Frank Borman said, "What about in the event that this doesn't work out well?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, what do we say to the widows?" All of a sudden, we all look at each other, and oh my God, if this thing ends with them not being able to get off the moon back into the module, what happens? They'll starve to death, or they'll have to commit suicide, or whatever. And you're not going to stay focused on them while they starve to death. So you have to close it off. But I thought, this was in the event of a disaster, you couldn't suddenly say, "What do we do now?" So I remembered a poetic line or two, and so I wrote a statement. And gave it to Haldeman, and he put it in his pocket, and didn't show it to anybody. And thank God it wasn't necessary. Certainly nothing I ever wrote that was spoken was as important as what was never spoken.
In their exploration, they stirred the people of the world to feel as one. In their sacrifice, they bind more tightly the brotherhood of man. In ancient days, men looked up at the stars and saw the heroes in the constellations. In modern times, we do much the same, but our heroes are epic men of flesh and blood. Others will follow, and surely find their way home. Man's search will not be denied. But these men were the first, and they will remain the foremost in our hearts. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind.
That is just one of the world's undelivered speeches, which together make up an alternative history of the past. The sober Nixon message also shows that politicians need to plan for a variety of outcomes. Thankfully, life and death events rarely force the rescheduling of speeches. Most undelivered speeches are not heard for good reason, discarded in the search for something better in a process which can be more scramble than system. David Frum was George Bush's speechwriter.
Having things end up on the cutting room floor is part of the policy process. One of the ways that you discover an idea is a bad idea is that you try to write it out. And in fact, the speechwriters are often the first people to know when an idea is not a good idea, because a lot of things sound good when you're spitballing them in the small hours of the morning or in the very early part of the day, and you start writing it, and suddenly it sounds like maybe this is not such a good idea. There's that great line from Harrison Ford to George Lucas during the making of the first Star Wars, which is, "You can write that shit, George, but you can't say it." And one of the things you discover when you go through the speechwriting process is there are a lot of things you write and you say, this is not convincing me.
Have you ever had the experience of watching a president or somebody you've written a speech to coming to a passage of the speech that's already in the agreed text and then deciding they weren't going to deliver it?
Oh, sure. All the time. Yeah, you often, there's a silly example of this, but this wasn't so much a surprise. In 2002, President Bush gave this must have been 2001, he gave the commencement address at Yale, his alma mater, and we wrote him a very, very funny speech. Too funny, in fact, with a lot of self-depreciating humor, and too much. And the president cut out some of the more brutal jokes and said sardonically, "I don't think there's anything easier than writing self-depreciating humor for somebody else."
Nothing better captures the chaos of speechwriting than the moment in Armando Iannucci's The Thick of It, when his backroom boys struggle to script a conference speech for their hapless minister. I don't know a speechwriter who hasn't suffered in that same conference hotel room.
Hit the full stops, don't run through anything.
I don't know what that means, hit the full stops.
Just stop it. Stop at the full stop, it'll sound good in the hall.
I won't gabble. What if they do me off?
But local people, finding their own solutions, having a real say over the future of the places where they live.
Well done indeed.
Some lovely stuff in there, I thought.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good actually, yeah.
Praise indeed from the Scottish Simon Cowell. Thank you.
What happened to the jokes?
I didn't say the jokes.
I think Glenn may have given me the wrong number on the printer.
We missed a whole page of Mannion jokes.
Not my fault.
I said where were we up to? You said 8. I printed from 9.
You said where were we up to?
Yeah.
So I said 8.
Yes, but we were up to 7, weren't we?
Well, you should have gone from 8. You went from 9. So that would have been quite good, because that would have just added a wee bit of Bob Hope, to all the doom and the gloom. Maybe next time, eh?
Hey, well, you said we were up to page 8, but we're in fact up to...
I said from 8.
Phil Collins was a speechwriter for Tony Blair and has worked with many Labour politicians, including David Miliband. Now he's a colleague of mine at The Times.
It's very reminiscent of what used to happen in the conference speech every year, because that speech is the one that takes place every year, where you've got 30 people involved, you've got 5 drafts going on at any one moment, you've got coffee cups thrown everywhere, you've got a bit of pizza, a bit of pie everywhere, you've got the Prime Minister in the middle of it all, holding the script up in his hands, tearing his hair out, saying, "What's happened to my joke?" It's a complete nightmare. It's total chaos. And the task is to try and get some order into that bizarre process.
And of course, what's most important is what you leave on the cutting room floor. I remember being called out of a speechwriting meeting once to look over a list of jokes that had been provided unsolicited by Ken Dodd, all of which were funny, obviously, but none of which were remotely usable.
I think that some of the best things I did was preventing things going into speeches rather than putting things in myself. Everyone thinks you're a speech writer, and they always want to know what's the best writing you've ever done. And the best things I ever did was prevented awful lines and terrible cliches from organising a speech. So, especially in the conference speech, where there's so many people want to have an involvement in it, trying to be the custodian and be the editor-in-chief and saying, no, we're not having that. We're not saying 21st century justice system. We're not saying hard-working families, because we always say that, and we're going to say something better. And being really pedantic and irritating about it is the best work I ever did. What you found was that the whole of the history of the Blair team would turn up for the conference speech. So in your normal work during the year, there'd just be usually the one of you or a couple of you writing the speeches, and then for the conference speech, everybody who's ever been involved with the Blair project would be there. So you'd finally have these hordes would come in, and everybody would have a strong view, and you'd end up writing by committee. I always likened it to the child's game, where one child draws the head of the animal, and the next child draws the midriff, and then a child draws the legs, and you end up with a speech a bit like that. And the task was always at the end of the day to make sure, a bit like pass the parcel, that you're the last one holding it, so that when you go back to your room, you can edit it and what I used to call smoothing it, which is to say rewrite it, take out all that nonsense that Alistair Campbell tried to put in and make it work again.
And of course, then a big part of the speeches are the speeches that never get delivered. What is delivered in the end is, of course, a very highly edited version of what there was in the first place. And sometimes it's accidental. In the case of the Hague speech, someone stepped on the printer cord and we left out an entire section on crime, which should have been in the speech. We were congratulated by The Guardian the next morning for not having included so much nonsense about crime like usual Tory party conferences. They didn't realise it was just an error.
There is a staffing process in the White House. You know, speechwriter works on a speech, having talked to as many people as possible, gotten various viewpoints, then putting his or her own spin on it, just for fun. Then you send it out, and if it's a big, important speech, 50 people would see it and had the right to make comments, as in edit sentences out, add sentences, kill paragraphs, add whole new thoughts that they thought, you know, might help the flow. It was like taking a bunch of fresh, new, bright, perfectly shaped vegetables and putting them through an old-fashioned meat grinder and rendering a smooth, textureless puree.
That was Ronald Reagan's speechwriter Peggy Noonan on Woman's Hour in 1991. She joined his speechwriting team in the 80s and is credited with writing his famous presidential address, delivered after the Challenger spaceship explosion in 1986. President Reagan quoted the American poet John Gillespie Magee and told the American people their valiant astronauts had slipped the surly bonds of Earth and touched the face of God. Surely one of the high points of the speechwriter's art. Noonan's frustration with the bureaucratic process that can turn such art into bland and formal statements is understandable. But there is a reason why such bureaucracies exist. It is to think of all eventualities. It's to make sure you don't end up like Mitt Romney.
I've just finished writing a victory speech. It's about 1,118 words, and I'm sure it'll change before I'm finished because I haven't passed it around to my family and friends and advisors to get their reaction. But I've only written one speech at this point.
Mitt Romney's undelivered victory speech in 2012. It's one of the great lacunae of contemporary political oratory. So, David, you observed the Romney campaign. Tell me what you made of his strategy on election night when he told reporters, "I only have one speech written tonight."
I was very close to a lot of people on the Romney team and to the speechwriting staff. I'd made suggestions to them from time to time, which were 100% discarded, for better or for worse. If Mitt Romney had been speaking merely with a competitor's deliberate self-confidence, that would have been one thing. But the lack of a prepared concession speech was revealed that campaign's inability to understand the dynamics of the election at all. It was apparent to me that they were going to lose. In fact, I wrote a book about why Romney was going to lose starting in September, why Romney had lost, starting in September of 2012 that we published on the Thursday after the vote. And I didn't have access to any of the internal polling data the campaign did. The fact that they did not know and were taken so by surprise explains why they lost. They had lost an understanding of what America is. It's not a speechwriting story. And maybe this goes to the most fundamental point you're driving at in these series of questions, which is speechwriting is not separate from the rest of the process of governing. It is part of it. And the ways that your speechwriting goes right or wrong tend to reflect on the way the rest of your organization goes right or wrong. And in the Romney campaign's case, the thing that went wrong was they did not understand their country, and therefore they did not understand how to talk about it or how to talk to it.
Do you think that he actually did only have one speech prepared?
Yes, I think so. Because he sincerely believed he was going to win. And we saw how late it was. That then they had to cobble together something at the last minute. And, the people on that team are capable, I know, of writing very gracious remarks in defeat. And while Romney made a perfectly acceptable concession speech, it wasn't the way you want to leave the stage.
I have just called President Obama to congratulate him on his victory. His supporters and his campaign also deserve congratulations. I wish all of them well, but particularly the President, the First Lady, and their daughters. This is a time of great challenges for America, and I pray that the President will be successful in guiding our nation.
The Romney victory speech has never been released, but that hasn't stopped the satirists from having a go at their own versions.
My fellow Americans, thank you, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for being here with me tonight. Not just our party workers, but more specifically, the ethnically selected demographic representatives who are standing directly behind me so that the TV cameras will catch them. There are many people who have made my victory possible, but you guys have made it seem plausible. Thank you. Smile, showing gums. It has been a long campaign, and frankly, I look forward to returning to my pod tonight to get some shutdown. We're taking back America. I believe in America. We are all Americans. The American dream. America. America. America, America. America, America. Wave. Smile. Wave. Smile. Hug wife. Smile. Hug child. Wave. Electric boogaloo. No. Execute walk program down runway. Smile. Auto. Off.
That's the trouble, you see, with unheard speeches, the speculation that can build up around them. If Mitt Romney was underprepared, perhaps you could say author Howard Jacobson had all his bases more than covered. The other voice you're about to hear is literary editor at The Observer, Robert McCrum.
Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of the 2010 Man Booker Prize is The Finkler Question by Howard Jacobson.
I'm speechless. Fortunately, I prepared one earlier. It's dated 1983. That's how long the wait's been.
My memory of that evening is amusing because I went into the Guildhall before in the kind of reception area before the prize, and I bumped into Howard, who's an old friend, and I said, inevitably, I said, well, I hope you win, and congratulations on having got so far, and, I think he was a second favourite or something. Well, not the favourite, but he definitely was in with a chance.
And I see here that there's another altered acceptance speech from 1994, then 2002, which I appear to have amended only slightly for 2004, 2006, and 2008.
So I said, I hope this is going to be a good night for you, and he said, I remember him very clearly. He said, I haven't... He's quite sad, and he can be quite sort of negative. He just said, I haven't won. Pessimistic. I haven't won.
I note that my language in these speeches grows less gracious with the years. You start to want to blame the judges who have given you the prize for all the prizes they didn't give you. Though they aren't, of course, the same judges.
And then, of course, he was announced as the winner, and he made this brilliant speech. So he obviously had prepared something, and he obviously had thought he was going to win. So I think all writers who go into that situation have a sentiment and a hope and expectation and a bottled up wish that they might win, but it doesn't always work.
Tonight I forgive everyone. They were only doing their job. Those judges, every one of whose names I could reel off.
Sometimes history comes at you out of a clear blue sky. 9/11 wiped the domestic agenda.
The whole site has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
That's the southern tower you're talking about.
Exactly. The second building.
We don't want to be too. I don't want to be too insensitive to this. The news started breaking about 2:15 about an hour ago. Two what looked like planes have crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, and one of the towers has collapsed. Terrorists are being blamed for the attack.
Center, we heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere.
And sometimes you aren't prepared for it.
The administration got a terribly late start. There are about 3 months between the election and Inauguration Day when you staff up the administration. And I came back from a week summer holiday, and then whammo, out of that beautiful September day came this national disaster, and everything was different.
Taking a look. Oh my God! Oh,
Presumably, though, on that day, I know you had to leave the White House and work elsewhere. You worked on plenty of things the president could say, but didn't. Was there an undelivered speech about 9/11?
Unfortunately, that day there were a lot of speeches that ought to have been undelivered that were delivered. Remember, the whole apparatus of the executive branch is broken. The president's on a plane flying around the western United States. The vice president is in a basement underneath the White House. The president's chief communication aide is in that same basement. The speechwriting staff is scattered hither and yon across the landscape. I was working first from the offices of the American Enterprise Institute, which are near the White House, and then from a secure location that had been improvised that wasn't a government building. Other speechwriters were stuck at home. They hadn't been able to. They were. If you were late to work that day, you didn't get into Washington. And one of the team, one of the most important members, was stuck at home. So and the phone networks are down, and so there are no cell phones, and we used pagers in those days. There are no pagers working. So the president gave a midday speech, I believe, from Barksdale Air Force Base that was more disturbing than saying nothing. And then he spoke again in the afternoon. Then there was a speech by his chief communications advisor, who took it on herself, although she's not a Senate-confirmed person and not somebody in the line of command at all. She took it on herself to make a speech to the public, and each of these speeches, I think, left the public feeling more alarmed. And none of them should have been delivered, because when you don't know what you're going to say, it's very important not to talk. And it's important to resist the temptation. This happens a lot in politics. Staffers will tell you the country is waiting to hear from the president. And in the hothouse environment of modern politics, you think, okay, that means they have to hear from him in the next half hour. You realize the next day they won't remember whether they waited half an hour or 2 hours or 5 hours. What they'll remember is whether what the president or the leader said was effective and appropriate or not. And if you speak repeatedly and badly, that you dig a hole for yourself that's very hard to dig out of.
Tony Blair has a tough task ahead of him this afternoon when he speaks to the TUC's annual conference in Brighton in just under 2 hours' time. His job will be to persuade an increasingly hostile union audience that greater private sector...
Mr Blair was due to address the Trades Union Congress at Brighton this afternoon. He cancelled that speech, but he had this to say about events in America.
I don't believe it would be appropriate to carry on the speech that I was going to give to you today. There have been the most terrible, shocking events taking place in the United States of America within the last hour or so.
This programme's obviously about great speeches that were never made, and one of the most famous in this country is the speech that Tony Blair was going to make to the TUC on 9/11. What had he planned to say that day, do you know?
Yeah, what he planned to say was to tell the TUC, as he usually did, that trade unionism was a dying force unless they were prepared to modernise. It would be to praise some of the good unions and to give them a fairly withering assessment of their prospects for the future. But as we know, that was not, in the end, the speech he delivered.
A sort of myth, it may be an urban myth really, has grown up that Tony Blair was going to talk about the euro this day and really pin himself to the euro, and then 9/11 happened and he didn't do it.
No, I think that is a bit of an urban myth. There was a section, as I recall, in the speech on the euro. I don't think it was quite as severe as that. I mean, you have to remember that question of the euro was so bound up in the conversation, long dispute between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, that actually that would have been a fairly combustible thing to have done. So it wasn't quite as good as all that.
Was it clear that day that he had to abandon it, or could he have pressed on?
No, it was absolutely clear he had to abandon it. It was clear to everybody immediately, I think, that the events were just too big, and that to have stood up before a trade union audience and given a speech on modernising trade union association and membership would have been an extraordinary and strange thing to do.
Do you think, though, that in speaking extemporaneously on that occasion, just briefly and from the top of his head, in many ways he made more momentous comments, and that may just be because of the occasion, because so much of speaking is linked to occasions?
I do think that. I think some of his very best moments are about occasion. I think that's just true generally of great speeches. They are the speeches that are made on great occasions rather than necessarily the greatest speeches. And I think when you have a moment like that, then the language can rise to it. You can risk more poetic language when you've got a big subject. And lots of speeches that politicians make are on quite small subjects. So huge rhetoric sounds rather inflated and grandiose and silly. Whereas a subject like that, it permits you to rise a bit. And also the fact that it's spontaneous, the audience has a different threshold. If they know you've scripted it and you're reading out prepared remarks, then the audience demands a higher standard. Whereas they know this is something you've had to think up off the top of your head, audiences give you more leeway.
Blair's undelivered TUC speech poses an interesting question. What might the decade have held for the Blairites and the Labour Party had 9/11 never happened? Had there been no wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and no Blair-Bush alliance? Can you draw a line between the events of that day and one almost 10 years later, when a former Foreign Secretary travelled home from Labour conference with his own undelivered speech, having just lost the race to be leader of the party to his own brother?
He worked for months rather than weeks on it. So there was a lot of work done, and it was very prepared, and it was absolutely ready. He was ready to go with it, as you would expect. I mean, anybody who went to that conference thinking they were going to win, as David Miliband did, ought to be prepared, and he was.
A full text, then?
Absolutely a full text. He was ready to speak. Now, that's not to say that that text would have been delivered, because, as you know, of a veteran of party conferences, all speeches at party conferences change in the last few days, and that speech was locked down with a few days to go. Now, had he won, he might well have altered it, but because it wasn't to be delivered immediately, it was to be delivered a few days later. So it's probable there would have been changes, but it was ready to go. It was finished in that sense.
Today, I set out the modern purpose of our party and how it is to be fulfilled. To ensure this government, misguided and misbegotten, fake and faulty, as dangerous as it is divided, is sent where it belongs, into the dustbin of history, driven from office as soon as possible. That's the obvious bit.
There was a decision to be made in the immediate aftermath of that leadership election about what the Labour Party said about its own recent economic history. And I think the two Milibands had different views on that and still have different views. Now, it's not to say that David would have delivered a speech that would echo the criticisms the Conservatives make of the Labour Party, because he wouldn't have done. It was coded, it was a muted acknowledgement, but there was more of a sense of an acknowledgement that when the crisis happened, though the crisis itself was not the fault of any government, because it was a global banking crisis, nonetheless, Labour had turned the taps on when they should have turned them off. Now, that is a different position from where the Labour Party is now. Our calculation was that would have altered the economic conversation ever since. We decided that we had to look it square in the face and try and alter things by making that concession and only that concession.
George Osborne says, we are in denial about the deficit because he wants us to be. So let's not be. It is a test. Step 1 is to recognise what is obvious. That we did not abolish the business cycle. We should never have claimed it. You can't in a market economy. And public spending plans cannot depend on it. Nor can you write your own fiscal rules and then be the judge and jury for how they are calculated and when they are met. We should have been proposing the creation of an Office of Budgetary Responsibility, and we should be campaigning today for its accountability to Parliament to be strengthened. There is no point in denying those things. They are true.
So when you're tidying your desk and you come across it by accident as a sort of speech equivalent of a ghost railway station, how does it make you feel?
It's a well-done written speech, and I still think that the judgment that's contained within it is right. I still think that the reason Labour, despite the economic travails of the country and the government, is behind the Conservatives on economic competence is because it's not trusted on the economy. And I think part of the reason it's not trusted is that it appears not to have acknowledged what most people feel about it, which was that it did spend too much in the latter years of its time in government.
David never got to deliver it, so there's a story that he read it to his wife in the car on the way home. Is that true?
I don't know whether that's true. I doubt that's true. That would be a fairly gruesome thing to have done.
Did he read it out to you?
As always, when you're preparing a speech, you read bits out. I mean, I'm amazed, actually, how few people read the speeches out when they're preparing them. There's so many speeches that are essays that people read out for the first time when they're standing up there. So, yeah, bits were read out in the course of preparation, but he never stood there in his kitchen and read the whole thing. We've got better things to do than that.
You will bring out the best in my leadership if I bring out the best in your leadership. That is what I am determined to do. Together, we can be the change that Britain needs.
David Miliband's undelivered victory speech giving added impact this week by the news that he's retiring altogether from politics. Victory speeches, like resignation speeches, are the bookends to a career. Nixon, never called upon to deliver the eulogy to the men on the moon, was one day destined to deliver his own funeral oration as he left office. His speechwriter, Ray Price, remembers that the build-up to his resignation was a time of great indecision for Nixon. He told the story to a gathering of White House speechwriters in the Miller Center at the University of Virginia.
We knew we were going to have to do a big Watergate defense, and Al Haig, then the chief of staff, organized a big meeting of department heads and so forth, and me and some others who were involved with stuff. They had charts and so forth, organizations, and assigning people for the battle, all the battle stations and so forth. I was out chatting with a couple of people outside of his office, and his secretary motioned me to come back in and said that was all sham. He wants a resignation speech. And to start on that, so I started on that, and then he decided against it. He was going to make a speech, but instead he was going to pledge to fight on and answer questions in the Senate, in the well of the Senate under oath, which I thought was a bad idea. And then at this along in here, somewhere along that way, looking at the whole, as we were getting the count, it looked to me as though it was impossible, better to end it cleanly. So, but it was a fairly momentous decision for a president to make. And he wrestled with it up and down. And then finally, let's see, I guess then we were up in Camp David that weekend, wrestling around supposedly on the how we were going to fight the battle. Then I got the word we're back on the resignation track, which was still, of course, very secret. We went back through several drafts on this from basically Tuesday to Thursday, back and forth. And then finally, as he worked it out in his own mind, and to say the things that he wanted to say, in the way that he wanted to say them, and then finally on Wednesday night, I thought we'd pretty well wrapped it up. We had a few things, and we went back and forth by telephone several times. I think I logged 8 telephone calls between 4:35 p.m. and 5:07 a.m. From him. I had gone about midnight to settle down, and I'd gone back home and finally went to sleep a little bit, but then my phone began ringing again as we worked out some of the final wording of it until it was done, and then watched him give it on Thursday night, hoping that he would maintain his composure. He did, and that was it.
To back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
The words Nixon might have used to argue his way out of resigning survive.
Whatever the mistakes that have been made, and there are many, and whatever the measure of my own responsibility for those mistakes, I firmly believe that I have not committed any act of commission or omission that justifies removing a duly elected official from office. If I did believe that I had committed such an act, I would have resigned long ago.
Perhaps the greatest ghost speeches, the ultimate might-have-been occasions, are those written as the tension mounts, preparing for the worst in a conflict.
Let's face it, the threat of hydrogen bomb warfare is the greatest danger our nation has ever known.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was one such occasion. America's eyes were glued to the television in 1962 as President Kennedy announced news of a kind everyone had feared. There were Soviet missiles in Cuba capable of hitting any city in the United States. Kennedy declared there would be a Cuban quarantine, a military blockade that restricted weapons and other materials to the island. That was the speech that was given, but it could have been a lot worse. There had been another option on the table, a more aggressive address announcing plans of an airstrike, an outcome that would have brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and beyond. A copy of the alternative speech remains.
With a heavy heart and in necessary fulfillment of my oath of office, I have ordered, and the United States Air Force has now carried out, military operations with conventional weapons only to remove a major nuclear weapons buildup from the soil of Cuba. This action had been taken under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations and in fulfillment of the requirements of the national safety. Further military action has been authorized to ensure that this threat is fully removed and not restored. There have been unconfirmed rumors of offensive installations in Cuba for some weeks, but it is only within the last week that we have had unmistakable and certain evidence of the character and magnitude of the communist offensive deployment.
Just how close the world came to war is clear from recordings made at the time and now held in the JFK Presidential Library. In the tapes we hear Kennedy's Joint Chiefs of Staff arguing in favour of an airstrike against Cuba.
It seems to me these two propositions should underlie our discussion. Now, what kinds of military action are we capable of carrying out, and what may be some of the consequences? We could carry out an airstrike within a matter of days. We would be ready for the start of such an airstrike within a matter of days. If it were absolutely essential, it could be done almost literally within a matter of hours. I believe the chiefs would prefer that it be deferred for a matter of days, but we are prepared for that quickly. The airstrike could continue for a matter of days following the initial day if necessary.
After 13 days of often tense debate, the government decided against an attack. There was simply too much at stake. Here's Ted Sorensen talking at Bard College in New York about the speech that Kennedy did present to the nation.
The tide of opinion around the table, we were meeting in the cabinet room, began to shift toward the other leading option on the list, which was a blockade around Cuba that would at least signal to the Soviets that we were responding, but it was responding in a passive way, not by attacking them and launching a war. The president then decided in favor of that second option and asked me to prepare his remarks to the American people. All this had begun on Tuesday morning, October 16, when he called me into his office, and he went on nationwide television on October 22nd, almost 6 days later. And that speech laid out in full for the American people and the world what it is the United States had discovered, what it meant in terms of a threat to the world's peace and security, and what the United States was going to do about it. Well, I have to say that a good many people about your age, Garrick, maybe a little younger, have said to me when I speak on this subject, they thank me for making the president's speech on the night of October 22nd so scary that they could convince their girlfriends that it was their last night on Earth.
I asked Bush speechwriter David Frum why he thought unheard speeches, like Kennedy's alternative Cuba speech, have so much resonance.
The speeches I suspect that have the most resonance are those that indicate the path of disaster. Like Eisenhower's famous message in the event that D-Day went wrong. I mean, that's probably the most haunting of them all.
Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone.
Most of the time, we don't think about the unlocked doors on the passages of history, the paths we could have gone down. We sometimes think of those for the better. We think about the bad things that happened and how they could have been avoided. What if we had stopped Hitler when he invaded the Rhineland, for example? But we are very blithe about realizing that we're surrounded by potential disasters, and they're averted. And I think this is one of the systematic unfairnesses of politics. Politicians tend not to get credit for bad things that don't happen. And yet, preventing bad things from happening is the most important thing that a politician can do.
No politician understood the importance of speeches in times of conflict more than Winston Churchill.
There never has been, I suppose, in all the world, in all the history of war, such an opportunity for youth. The Knights of the Round Table, the Crusaders, all fall back into the past. Not only...
My name is Alan Packwood, and I'm the director of the Churchill Archive Centre at Churchill College, Cambridge. The Churchill Archive Centre holds the personal papers of Sir Winston Churchill, an enormous archive of some 1 million items in 2,500 boxes, but including his drafts and his notes for his famous speeches and broadcasts. Well, Churchill was an orator who prepared extremely thoroughly. He knew how much was riding on these speeches. He would dictate, the draft would be set down in normal typescript, and he would then go through that draft, sometimes several times, refining it and correcting it prior to broadcast or delivery. Well, I mean, the great thing about these speeches is that they allow you to see Churchill's thought process at work. So you can see him playing with ideas and refining ideas, and sometimes, of course, you can see really significant changes.
Given their documentary importance, given that they're one of the few ways we can glimpse the history that doesn't happen, archiving speeches and speech notes is an important historical task.
It's wonderful to look at drafts or to look at rejected documents, rejected speeches, material that wasn't given, because it gives you a wonderful insight into the questions and dilemmas that these top politicians and statesmen were struggling with at the time. I think there is a huge danger nowadays that draft speech material is not kept in the same way. In this computer age, quite often what survives is just the final clear copy, perhaps corrected to reflect actual delivery. And what you lose is all of the drafting, all of the input from expert advisors, the corrections, the material going in and out. You have to hope, of course, that in this day and age of using Microsoft Office and Word, that sometimes these people will keep track changes on, which will allow you to go back and reconstruct at least some of the process that's gone into these great speeches. But I don't think that material is necessarily systematically kept in the same way.
But even if a speechwriter isn't convinced of the necessity of archiving, at least it helps with a messy desk. David Frum again.
I am a really bad record keeper, and I'm very sloppy with files. And by the time I'd been in that office for 18 months, and we used a lot of paper in those days. I mean, it was kind of dawning to me when it came time to leave. I was looking at this paper and like, what am I going to do with this? And at that moment, somebody from the Presidential Record Office shows up and says, you can't take any of this with you. You understand that this all goes into boxes and is put in the Presidential Library. And I felt like a burden had really. I walk out of here with like my pencils and nothing else. It's all this junk is yours. So it's all there in mine and everybody else's. And by the end of the Bush administration, of course, we had made that final transition from paper to electronics. But we would have an important speech might go through 30 or 40 drafts. So even though, I mean, the speech may be delivered, but draft one counts as an undelivered speech. And draft one is in an archive somewhere, waiting for somebody to discover.
What is the greatest rhetorical gem that is like the Ark in Raiders of the Lost Ark, hidden in a Bush library in some box?
Oh, well, one thing that will be, I think the very first draft of Bush's speech to Yale in the summer of 2001, with all the jokes, all the jokes that the president thought were too sharp and too mean. That's the jokes that were delivered were still pretty good, but that's waiting down there. I think a lot of the anguish over how we responded on the day of 9/11 itself, that's there to be found. The administration was really caught off guard and didn't behave well. And of course, the big question that, and I don't know the answer to this, is when did President Bush decide to go to war in Iraq? That's probably the single most important historical mystery about the Bush administration. The more we learn about those days, actually, the more unclear that question becomes.
The history revealed by unspoken speeches can lighten tension and bring relief. For some, it can bring healing. For others, a sense of longing for something irretrievably lost.
Well, for me, it goes back to my days at a Catholic boarding school in Dumfries, where I was standing by a radiator in Form 3, and I burned my finger on the radiator as I was looking out the window, and it was announced at 7:30 in the evening that Kennedy had been shot in Dallas.
Here is a special bulletin from Dallas, Texas. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas, Texas.
President Kennedy had been due to talk that day at the Trademark Building in Dallas.
The speech in itself is, probably had it been given, would not have gone down as one of Kennedy's legendary speeches by any means. But there's a lot of aspects of it that are very much 1963. You know, it talks about the situation in Cuba, and it talks about American economics at the time. And when you read through it, it's very much aimed at the South and unifying the South with the North. And that was really part of what Kennedy was doing on that trip when he was assassinated, was to come down to the South that really wasn't a supporter of his at that time. And it's very much a speech of unification and kind of saying, look, you know, although perhaps you don't agree with all of my policies and perhaps you didn't vote for me, I want you to understand that you are important to this country's future and to the future of America and our position in the world.
I am honored to have this invitation to address the annual meeting of the Dallas Citizens Council, joined by the members of the Dallas Assembly, and pleased to have this opportunity
to salute the Graduate Research Center of the Southwest.
The motorcade is coming by here. I can see many motorcycles coming by now, police motorcycles. Just had a call on the radio for all units along Industrial to pick up the motorcade. Something has happened here. We understand there has been a shooting. The presidential car coming up now.
As a tribute to Kennedy, department store owner Stanley Marcus commissioned a hand typeset and bound edition of his unspoken speech. 500 copies were sent to Kennedy's family, friends and associates, with the very first given to Jacqueline Kennedy. Decades later, Peter Wood and Cliff Sims came across a copy and were inspired to start up the Unspoken Speech Project to mark 50 years since Kennedy's death. For the past few months, they've been asking Dallas citizens to hold up a word taken from Kennedy's speech, which is recorded and will be played out as a short film.
Somebody holding a word from the speech is as powerful as the word itself. It's their tribute, their sensibility, their thinking about Kennedy, and their kind of celebration in a strange kind of way in holding that word. And what we found as we handed people words on the street and in offices and various places that we went, people just took them. As soon as we said JFK unspoken speech, it was very strange. People just took them and kind of hugged them and kind of didn't want to let them go.
Above all, words alone are not enough. The United States is a peaceful nation, and where our strength and determination are clear, our words need merely to convey conviction, not belligerence. If we are strong, our strength will speak for itself. If we are weak, words will be of no help.
Speeches are generally, at least, and this is my interpretation of it, but they mark points in history. You know, certain speeches are given and
history goes in one direction perhaps because of that speech, or things go down in history because of that speech. And I think there's a fascination with people in general with speeches that, for whatever reason, were never given. The fascination is, had they been given, would history have taken a different course? And I think it's kind of looking down a road that history didn't go down because that speech wasn't made, and wondering what if, or what might have been had it have been given. You know, if JFK, for example, had given this unspoken speech and he hadn't been assassinated, would we have gone to, or would the Americans have gone to war with Russia? Who knows? That the answer will never be known. But had this speech been given, had Texas sort of rallied around and the South kind of rallied around the North, and history taken a different course, there's a fascination with that.
We, in this country, in this generation, are by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength.
Underline our strength.
For as was written long
ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain.
I worked as a speechwriter for many years, and one of the conceits when you work in such a job is that you can change history, change minds, move people with the power of your words. But in truth, the best you can do is capture a moment. And for most of us, most of the time, that moment is banal, the spring conference of an opposition party or whatever. But what this does mean is that in the archives of the speechwriter, history lives, telling the story as it was at the instant it was lived, expressing the mood and sentiment just as it was before retelling and false memory changed it forever. And I suppose that's what makes untold speeches so thrilling. They too capture a moment, but it's a moment that never came. A glimpse of the road not taken. Our one way of seeing a future that became a past without ever being a present. There for all time to answer the question posed by that most powerful of human longings. If only.